Just at the very beginning, I was having a beer with Masa last night, and so I just wanted to just interject this one little slide here, which might be of curiosity. On the right-hand side is actually from the Maeda family in Kanazawa, and took the photograph in 2007. Basically, the Yukimi lantern has not really been found in the water, and actually, this image here is actually from Tomura and Katsuo Saito, and actually he's sort of doing his work, and just I'll be showing it. There's actually a hidden basin stone that's always been used actually with Yukimi, so it actually is for the tide coming in. So it sits about 2 or 3 inches in the water. So this is going back now to 1938. The book itself was actually published in 1968, I believe. That was Katsuo Saito designing Japanese gardens, just out of curiosity.
Thank you, that was probably for me.
Sorry?
I said thank you, that was probably for me. That was catching with NASA yesterday.
Oh, I see, okay. It just sort of, it sort of popped up and came up, and I sort of went, oh, okay, yeah, and actually it's been around for like a long time, but you know, this is where it is, and I'll just kind of pop it up there and show you where it is. So part of this presentation was actually put out in Chicago, and this was actually a year ago. Primarily, what we have here is that we have windows of opportunity for being able to prune, which are only about 2 weeks long. So when you actually get down into the States, and places I've been in Tucson, for example, the season starts in September and October. So all of a sudden you're sort of going in and it goes bang, now it's spring. And you go, I don't know, I'm sorry, spring was actually earlier, March, April, and all of that kind of stuff. And suddenly you're going, I'm going to have to change what my idea here is, and how am I going to prune, when am I going to prune, and what do I actually get out of it, and what will the tree get out of it? So why are we managing trees? In the entire scope of things, we actually need to get the feelings, reconnection, we need health, we need actually a sense of well-being for almost everything. We can't do utility, and that's functionality. So I mean, we have street trees, we will have cities, parks, everything else, which is basically the public and so on and so forth. We basically have like a continuity of experience, which is a public garden. We have sort of moving people and moving them through spaces. So trees do all of those different things. There's signboards, billboards, all those other things. Okay. Sotogaki sleeve fences to screen the site, and that's actually basically to screen it. And you know, basically pruning is a way to actually manage those. Going to jump you right into a case study, and I just want to say one thing for housekeeping here. Most of the image, or some of the images that are on here, are not mine. They're actually somebody by the name of Nobuharu, and they belong to actually Niwa Landscape Architecture magazine. So it's not really for public use in that sense. These are entirely for educational purposes. Just want to say that, okay? As in my thanks to them. Case study. I work for the Nikkei National Museum and Cultural Center in Burnaby as well, and work as an editor for them. But here we're looking at this particular maple. And it's actually a mountain maple. Now in turn, this tree here is probably about 90 years old, and was started actually by one of the first Issei that actually came over. They actually moved it onto the site, and I sort of taken care of it in between. It used to be placed just a little bit to the right-hand side where this katsuri is in a pot, and so it's just to the right-hand side. In this particular installation, no one has actually bothered to care for this. And the question is, why are they not caring for it? Underneath that is a camperdown elm. It's got a very aggressive root system. But this is what happens to a maple tree when it's actually left out. So what would you do? How many times a year would you actually prune that? Or once, or twice, or 3 times, 4 times? How do you actually go about managing it? Because which one is more important? Do you want to replace a maple that actually has no value per se? And as far as provenance is concerned, this one here is much more valuable. So now we're actually talking about how do you actually manage the plants rather than actually just saying, yeah, we'll go in and just let it grow and grow and grow and grow. This is up close, and you can see that this is actually 1 year. I was looking for the earlier photos from the spring when I was there, and this actually used to be right in that neighborhood for a canopy. But because it's a mountain maple, it's hugely aggressive. So where this outside line is, right there, is actually where the roots are going to be at this point in time. So this is dying, and the entire inside right in here is totally dying. So what would you actually do? How many times a year would you prune it? Any options, volunteers?
I prune it once in the heat of the summer in July.
Heat of summer, July. Okay, would that be July for the tree, or would that be July for people? And that's actually the question of what this presentation is. So thank you. I appreciate that. We would actually prune this 2 times, is what my boss basically says, and I said 3 times. And so I would actually go in basically in the summer. Yes, our summer. Would I do it in the heat? You have to be careful with how many leaves you actually bring out, because in that sunlight, it's going to burn and they're going to wither, so you can't really have that either. So it's going to have to be later on, or during the period of time when it's cloudy. So just to answer that one. That's what maple whoops. Yes, it is sensitive. That's what maple should look like, is right there. And that's being just pruned, then it will fill in right there, and right up to there. It'll have an entirely canopy that goes over. And it's the same configuration, it's the same building as a matter of fact, which kind of sort of amazes me because they've got everything nicely pruned on this side. There's a pine right there. It's a black pine as well. And there is that maple. So why wouldn't they actually manage it in the same way? At the same time, we actually have earth, man, heaven, earth, man, heaven, going all the way back up again. So we're talking about basically Ikebana, the bonsai that comes up later on, and how you're actually balancing that whole thing out. There's a side view. You have the same thing. Sunlight, so it's actually a solar collector where the sunlight comes in the afternoon, and these are the errant ones that you know you're going to prune later on. And this is actually where the tree is grown in. There's no roots on this side for competition. So that other pine that is there, it has too much competition. It can't really do anything. So most things are grown in competition. Case study 2, same place, building the other side. You take a look at these fir trees on this side. Behind this is a power plant, and that power plant has nothing but vertical elements on it. So now we're getting a little bit into design, where the trees are going to be in design and taking up the vertical. If you put a whole bunch of vertical lines with vertical lines, the vertical lines disappear. It's a funny thing with the way the eye works. So in this, on the inside, we have that. And this is basically the garden space. These are actually the fir. And right back in there, we actually have the electrical stuff. And so actually, everything's blended all the way together. So what do you actually do? And how are you actually going to manage it? There's actually the top view, so that you actually have the hedging. And you can virtually almost see through that. So as this grows up to that height right there, if it's anything beyond this, we don't even really need it. We don't even need that from the inside because it's only this high. That window is right in there. So therefore, all of this is extra, but nobody's actually gone in and actually pruned it. So how are you going to maintain it? The roots are massively aggressive, and at the same time, it's getting emptier and emptier right down here. So you let it grow up here. Cut off something off here, it will never grow back. Definitely a problem. So you need a management technique. So what are you going to choose? Japanese pruning basically says that you can do any one of these basic shapes with that tree, and this is actually in the Teubert Gardens. This is earlier on. This is Junji Shinada's work. And essentially that's one way that you could actually manage it. You could empty it out that way, because what you really need is you need the vertical trunk at the bottom to be able to hide what is on the inside to make that garden work. So you could choose this form. You could empty it out. You could use this one. You could use this, because it still has the vertical forms on it. You could use this one, say okurikumi. You could end up using this one even. It doesn't really matter. The question is, you're going to have to choose one and be able to make that into a maintenance schedule and a maintenance process to be able to make it work sustainably for you. I'm going to go back to photographs. In the 2 parts of this, basically we didn't cover the aesthetics before, and just sort of going, what are the aesthetics? And are they different, or are they the same as what we find in North America or not? They're actually a little bit different. They're actually made for people, for humans, for the way in which we actually live. Here, your eyes are basically going to, they're going to expand all around this. So wherever you have darkness, your pupils will end up dilating and you'll feel comfortable. When you go into a brighter space, your eyes will actually pinpoint and you become very, very uncomfortable. And that's the difference. So when you're pruning, you're actually looking for a tree species, and you're looking for a method of pruning that, if you're supposed to relax, the amount of light refraction from those leaves is going to calm you and enlarge your pupils. Or, if you want people to move away from it, you don't want them to look at it and want them to move along, you will have a higher light source, pinpoint the pupils, and people will move away from that as being uncomfortable. And that's how you actually move them from A to B. In that sensitivity, we also have aware, we also have shibui, we also have fusei, and fusei being basically that breeze feeling, that open mountain fresh air that comes in. It has a couple of other meanings to it, but that's the important one for this particular piece. So here, you're actually inviting people to come along and actually take a look that you actually have life brought into this particular scene with water. That actually is going to affect all of these. Yesterday, actually, when we were doing the blindness and walking through and everything else like this is actually going to give you an open area so that you can actually feel air moving through. And we don't have that actually here in Canada outside of, the 70-kilometer winds that we have right now, right? But basically, this is the aesthetic, and this is actually a T. Again, aesthetics here, we actually go into Shin-gyo-so. So Shin is man-made. Gyo is actually the combination between man-made and so, nature. So it's a sort of a sliding scale that moves back and forth that you can actually use. Now, this actually will also translate then to Jin-chi-ten. And this actually is where you find it on bonsai, because we're going to get into that a little bit later on today. So earth, man, and heaven working in harmony. And basically, you look at, this is man-made. So this is actually the ratio of Shin. So you normally have, for example, this wall, this ceiling, everything else, that is man-made. You would have different gradations of it, but now you would actually adjust that lower and say, this rough piece here is man-made. This would actually be Gyo, so it's actually roughed out from nature, and this is actually nature. So when you're looking at photographs, and when you're looking at a plant and a tree and what it does in the relationship of what you're pruning, you have to understand why you're doing it. So you first of all have to, pruning 101, go in and say the shape of what this is going to be is, what does it actually do? Is it a screen? Is it a filter? Is it what is that going to be? And then here, we need a management technique for this. So if this is going to overgrow, we're no longer going to have the effect of kisei, this movement that is actually happening right in here, so that this entire setting will not be felt. So if you make these trees too strong, this is lost. You make this too strong, this is lost. These need to be in sort of a harmony. So earth, man, heaven, earth, man, heaven, need to work in harmony all the time. And you sort of keep that in mind when you're going through the photographs. Then you have a sense of awe. This is actually the old gardens. This is actually used to be the display gardens that they used to actually have. And these delight me because we no longer do this kind of work. And, I can find this stone, and every once in a while you get these that are like 20, 25 tons, that sort of a thing. And what you actually have here is equipoise, so you have equidistance on a position. And there is a definition for it. I kind of disagree. The way that I've actually come to have it translated is that it's positioned, or its poise, is equidistant between falling and moving, and that creates actually the science or the sense of awe. And so we actually have this vast chasm that goes in and actually creates distance. If any of this is too strong, you're going to lose that. All of this is going to be lost if this becomes very strong, or if this becomes stronger here, you're not going to have this piece right in there. It's not going to have any impact to you. So you actually need that balance to be able to feel something human in there that is going to change that. So then you get the popular classics. And you have black pine and the different shapes that there are going to be. And it's so common to basically see the Misaki lantern put out there, the empty space in between, and so on and so forth. But if these become too strong, you don't see that. And what are you trying to actually say? So basically you have, heaven, you have earth, and you have man. And if you make this too strong, then heaven is too strong. This is more a comment on what is heaven. So you're actually speaking to people as though it's a billboard, and understand that your tree is a billboard through which you actually communicate. Again, where there's actually no foliage whatsoever, you have to manage it. Is there a temptation to put something into this corner? Will it actually detract from this triangulation compared to this part of the standard? And that's a basic as well, that essentially has just something to go by in the balance. And yet, because of where everything is, we don't even really see this. So it keeps everything focused there. It's basically sort of a control device. So these pieces actually control everything. If that tree that we don't really notice anymore, but that's what we need to prune, becomes too strong out to about there, it makes that dark and far away. And then all of a sudden that will come into play. So you actually have to balance that tree in a very particular manner. So you're looking at how do you actually get a maintenance technique. So we're not looking at style anymore. we're actually looking at just purely how do you maintain it, and you're looking at pruning as a maintenance program rather than let's go into the style. I'm not talking about style. This here again in Chatto, so in T, pure base. These are gorgeous to work with, the basic background. This is actually part of your maintenance package of what you're pruning as well. If this gets too strong and moves down into here, because of its weight and so on, you won't have any of these effects. Your entire atmosphere will be lost. This would have been right across here at some point in time. You can see where it's grown up and they've cut something out right here. Now they need to figure out a way to actually make this very gently back, but make it look natural. So in T, your pruning needs to be so, or absolutely natural in pruning. And that's one of the hardest things to do. Once again, this is actually Campo. This is actually the healing garden. What you're looking for actually in this is the triangulation. So if you take a look at these triangles that are created, this creates movement. This creates something static. If this tree is too strong, then you're not going to see this or the triangulation that is actually created there. In this one here, they're actually creating your eye movement and keeping it actually framed and contained right down here so that you will actually see this little triangle. So these trees, all that they are is just a framing foil so that actually there's too much pixelation, or basically there's too much input from this so that you don't want to look at the discomfort of this, and you will actually look there. What happens to the brain is that when you no longer want to see this and you go to a dark spot, is that your brain suddenly empties and you're allowed to see your own thoughts and hear your own thoughts and put your own thoughts into this, and that causes you to relax. So that's your job as a pruner, and that's your job in actually maintaining these trees. Then you get Zoki no Niwa. So this is a little bit new, Jihei, Kogama Jihei. And basically looking at the weed garden is where it started from, and just simply the average, natural, normal trees that were all around. And what you actually have is that you get a sense of community with these. Now, if you take a look in the previous presentation of NAJGA, we actually had where this actually creates communities. These lines join right about there. These lines curve and join there. These line curves and joins there. So everything is down here. So when you're planting a tree, you don't plant it straight up and down. Actually plant it at an angle. It's very important to actually have that angle so that you actually create community. If you put them separately and apart, then all you get is one over here, one over here, one over here, and it's like people that don't talk to each other. But if they're actually inclined to each other and you humanize them, the anthropology, then things will begin to work. And yes, there's sort of the implied path, but it's not put in. Whoops. Come back, please. There we go. So right here is that implied path, but we're actually moving across this way. Here is the path, and here actually you're making it entirely nature. So you're sending another message. Keep your thumb away from that. There we go. And right here, we basically say, yes, you can walk, and we're telling you how to walk and to basically be more careful as you come up to it. Then you have a bridge that warns you actually. And this tree here bumps you over that way. So you've actually stripped the leaves and needles and basically all the small branches and everything else from there, but you've kept that little elbow there. Because that elbow, if you were to cut that off, exposes that too much. And that is what actually guides you safely across there, because that stone technically could be larger, but then if it's larger, you're hiding that and it turns into one big circle that goes, you adjust one thing. You take out that little branch, you're going to have to fix a whole bunch of other stuff. So the importance of your job as a pruner is really, really quite critical. It's not as easy as just kind of going, yeah, okay, we're going to prune this today. You actually have to think about what the design is, think about why it's there, find its purpose, and go onwards from there. And that brings us to control devices. When you look at the scene, this actually gives you a horizontal, causes calm. This causes calm. This is your triangulation. Your triangulation, though, is angled and echoed by this. So you have one right there. You have one right there. That's your job. If you're a pruner, that's your job. You have to understand that. You have to go in and say, yeah, I'm not touching this garden until I actually understand why and what you actually need. This, if you actually took this out, or if you had more than this, and growing out to the sides or whatever it is, you're not going to see this piece right in there. You're not going to see the base and how deep it is. This is going to feel unsafe. This is going to be too much mystery. It'll be too dark and too threatening. You're not going to go there. So your job is to actually keep this nice, wide open, bright, and sort of an invigorating atmosphere so that you can actually go in there. And that's actually where it makes a difference. So the amount of light refraction And reflection that is happening here and here and here makes this dark. Anything dark we like to gravitate to. It's human nature. We go into caves. On this one here, if you take a look at this one, how much larger could you grow it? Maybe up to about there. Then it's touching the eaves, but all of a sudden it'll give it a sort of a sense of mystery if it's out in front. Say it's in line right up to here, it makes it like a very long cave, and it'll be a distance. It doesn't make it as immediate. This actually brings, without in the background, brings this right up to the very, very front. So you're actually now creating a sense of scale. What is human? What is a human size? What is a human effect that makes you and allows you to actually interact with it and walk into it very comfortably? This is being a front entrance way. If you let all of these grow, and if you actually created the canopy, it's cute. It's really kind of nice in a Western sort of a way, and we have something else to walk through. But do you really want a dark corridor at that point in time? You would actually have to find the client and find the means or find the reason for actually having that there. Or keep it completely open so it's bright and people come in with a very open atmosphere. So if you want them to feel mystery, fill it in. Go right ahead. There's nothing wrong with it. You can basically choose and decide those things. But you're choosing something different and you're actually making a choice between processes. Once again, this is the device that actually separates space. This tree right here controls everything. You take it out, that is immediately right in the foreground. It's right in your face. Why should you bother going there? There's absolutely nothing. You see everything right there. You would actually avoid this path right over there. So if this were to die or come out or be pruned too heavily, then you're going to actually have to put something back in or wait until it grows. This actually is a guidepost. You take that out and all of a sudden it's too far open. You're going to want to keep on going this way instead of actually going right into the middle. So it actually guides you to go in the middle. Your trees are very important. Same thing is here when you actually come down onto it so that you will actually go into this and feel actually safe crossing over right into that area right there. This part here is almost getting too strong there, and you go, what's wrong with this picture? Do we take it off there? Do we take it off there? If you take it off here, your horizontal is the hardest thing to find, the hardest thing to grow. And you basically can't grow horizontals or down, but you can't grow up all the time. So this actually needs to be pruned probably right in there. This canopy could fill in, but you have different solutions. What's your purpose? Go back to your purpose. Do you actually use it? Then maybe if you close this over, do you want this to be like a dark corridor, or do people just glance and get the sound of water as they go by and say, oh, life, oh, that's nice, and they're walking up to a place. Maybe that's enough. Last part is that you design and you don't take precedence. You actually understand that balance of everything. We've been going more and more and more modern, just simply to show you that there's traditional and then there's actually modern gardens as well. There's contemporary ideas, and these are all still 100% Japanese gardens. The more modern you go, the more traditional you actually are. For example, this shape actually comes from somewhere. It's like part of a sleeve. This actually is another aspect, it's part of a boat, and so on and so forth. This, if it's too strong, will end up covering the sign. You can't see it. This will end up covering up what's behind it. So you need to keep everything sort of working in that harmony. So earth, man, and heaven working in harmony. And again, this is Shin, this is Gyo, and this is So. This is also So. So now you have to do some natural pruning on this. If you wanted to, and if you want to guide people around this and in here, if you had this highly pruned, people will always gravitate towards something which is highly pruned, which is one of the reasons why we sculpt like tamamono or pines really heavily and everything else. You want people to go there. But if you do it all over the place and people don't know where to go anymore, they just kind of look at it and go, yeah, too much information. Yeah, I should have passed that one by. So you just keep on going. You go, yeah, okay. But you have one or two, it'll work just fine. You have this, you don't see this, so each has to echo it. So this and the water, the life, plays off of this and actually controls part of that. These trees, you can't really bring too much of it in there because it'll be too powerful for this. This echoes this. That, which is actually clay, then actually echoes this. And that curve is found right there. That's actually shake. Shake is not your view. Shake is how you bring the view in and you actually have it in a closed space as well. So this is actually echoed here because you turn this sideways and goes from there. Same as I don't have a picture of Roanji, but it's actually, Roanji is actually Cassiopeia, a constellation, when you turn it upside down. Okay, so it's actually very, very familiar, and that's actually one of the reasons why we wonder about it, because we're seeing something in a mirror, and it always kind of resonates with us. This resonates, and it resonates all the way through all these different shapes. and the triangulation. It's really a marvel to actually look at. You know, doing this kind of work, yeah, I wish. You know, if I could get really good, I'll do that. And this is the absolute contemporary. Is the point of this, how much nature? So this tree here, this is probably about the first or second year after installation for this guy. And would it distract if this came all the way out here to block out that window? Because your other part of the job is to actually make sure that you have an enclosed space, if that's it, as in Sakuteki and so on and so forth. You actually fix the site first before you actually get around to actually designing. So what you have up top here allows you to see something below it. In the previous presentation, it's that V that actually allows you to see things in between. So once you take this photograph, we're seeing a lot of this, and we notice it. Once it's cut off here in this view here, we actually see the point of what the objective of this design is. And that's, once again, it's your job to fix this tree for the client. So that's where your pruning comes in. Question now is, you don't know when you're going to go in there, you don't know when the client's going to call you, you don't know what the parameters are, yet you're going to have to make decisions on it. One more, and I couldn't resist, because again, this is just simply so much as a cabana, it's so much as bonsai, it's just simply such a pure and simple idea that, you have, basically you have the water, you have sort of earth, you have heaven, like sky, and you have open space, you have the proverbial weeping willow that is very human and just almost brings us to tears. One of Masa's earlier lessons was basically when you prune, always have a key word, because your key word when you hold your pruners is actually going to change where you actually are in your pruning action, and subtly changes every action that you take on that. So you repeat that word all the time, and it's going to give you a totally different effect. Oops, backing up. This right in here, if this was actually a weeping tree, it wouldn't work, because then it takes away from this here. It would be more human to weep with that tree. So this actually has to be upright and has to have a mentality or a sensation of being very mobile. And yet at the same time, this is basically the focus. This lines everything up. This crosses it over, creates triangulation. It works really, really well. It's very successful. Once again, Shingo-so, and you can relate that on different levels. And the reason I do this is because here you have kate. So the Japanese garden is, by definition, so when you're actually pruning and doing this stuff, that you are actually homogenizing, especially in front entranceways. You're actually looking at the outside people and making the front neighborhood and everything else being conducive to the neighborhood at the same time as being personal. So you want the outside, we have no feelings, and then as you're walking in, you're getting a little bit more and more and more personal. Right up to the inside of this area where you're walking in and going, yes, we have the shape, and the water flows and makes it all alive. In this one here, again, we have the metal waterfall, which, once again, so, and then you have actually gyo, and you actually have shin. So this part turns into shin, gyo, and so. Losing my mind on the next one here. We're moving into the meat of all of this. Where the garden is, now, there was one comment actually, I think actually maybe we're talking to Cody, and we were discussing actually the Nikka Yuko, and that the front entranceway was commented that it feels a little bit off. This actually used to be the kitchen entrance, and right in the back of the old samurai residences in Kyoto and so on, this was actually where the night soil was kept, so it was actually an open corridor. So it always feels kind of strange to have a garden in there, but it was sort of this abandoned space, and that became the Tsubaniwa. So just sort of a sidebar of what you're feeling, but the important part is that this is actually some of the best gardens, actually. So where we're talking is like these gardens in the back, and keep in mind that it could be a different area. So this has a different idea behind it in terms of outside relationship to the inside relationship of what the client wants. This one here is going to be entirely his own private thought and how it actually relates. This is even a little bit more private because outside of the bedroom it actually correlates to all of this where it opens up. So keep in mind where everything is and that you're bouncing back and forth, and how intimate it is going to actually affect that pruning in between as well. So you've got a lot of factors to look at in the management process. Gardens are artificial constructs to me. I am notorious and have become very notorious for just simply turning the water off on something and finding out what lives. If it lives, it's absolutely great. It's sort of, the background teachings from Masa that sort of come out and say, if it's too hard to actually maintain, if it doesn't really live that well, cut it out, take it out, put something else in, or make it basically work and it will adjust. Which is funny because I later on found out that actually plants are xeric and that they will actually become xeric and that they actually change their physiology. Get into a little bit of that as well later on. So my question was, and going back and forth to Japan, was how do you end up getting these scenes that are so much the same? So this view is actually from here looking in. And this is actually from an old book and ends up being sort of a woodblock print, and it's sort of given out as one of the poster cards, tourist cards, and so on and so forth. But primarily, this view has not really changed, and some of the trees are exactly the same way in the same place. I know of some that are actually 300 years old and they're still doing the same thing at the same size, and that's where a lot of the questions end up starting out. So why is sustainability important? Basically, it's plants become naturalized, they're adapted. So if nature competes and is in competition, Japanese gardens are microcosms of nature, and therefore they grow in competition. Now in turn, the roots of different species, they don't really grow over each other. So again, about 30 years of being an arborist and sort of having to write these reports, working for the city of Calgary, back and forth, and you find out that in a lot of ways, we don't have trees that actually grow over each other. I can also find the other side to this, where tree roots do grow over other ones, depends on which one is more dominant, which one is stronger, and so on and so forth. So what it does is it actually creates tree pots. And you're technically looking at bonsai, and that sort of immediately touches back into being a kid and 7 years old and learning pinching and so on and so forth, and 10 years starting to learn bonsai, and what exactly do you do with a pot, and how does a tree grow in a pot, where and what will actually happen to it. So basically your competition right here means that you can actually take a lot of the gardens, and a lot of the gardens that I looked at that looked overgrown at first glance in Japan end up being gardens that are actually grown in competition. And most of the gardeners would end up saying, gee, 30% of the stuff in my work is already done because it's already in competition. They're not going to grow anymore for the amount of moisture and water they get here. We don't really have irrigation. We've turned off irrigation. In the 17th century, 16, 15, and back, we didn't have irrigation, so you basically had to build a natural garden. So why not replicate something that worked at that particular point in time so that you could actually say, yeah, this is sustainable. I have to work less. I like it when I work less because I get new clients. I have new clients, I make more money. I'm very happy that way. So basically it works. So in making less work rather than more work. So the shape of the tree indicates the biome. And here in Alberta, we basically have branches that stick up this way. And if you take a look, right here, this branch goes down. Yes, it's been trained, but bear with me. This here goes up. So actually when we're running around in the mountains, these are all actually going up. So what happens is that the water collects on here and it runs all the way down the trunk, runs down here, and then goes into basically the root zone. It comes in here and it collects. So this root system is actually going to be very close. In Japan, and where there's like lots of moisture, everything grows and hangs like this. Like the proverbial shape of the maple that everybody's trying to get is everything hangs. And we only have the Aesculus, the Ohio buckeye here, that actually grows and actually has leaves that hang. Everything else goes like this, the Genalias, Tartaricums, everything which is native, they're all going to be spiky and all the water goes in. It's dry. And that's actually where you get that total difference. So that means you have to prune differently. So now you're going to actually have to make a management decision between whether or not you're going to actually fight with this branch going up all the time to get it to hang like this, and whether you can actually succeed at maintaining that for a long period of time, and how many man hours will it take to do that? I mean, anything is possible. But do you really want to fight that much? Or do you want to work with a design to put in something else to actually give the sense of that angle going downwards in a different way? What are you going to do? And how much do you actually want to fight with it? Let's go back to the very beginning part of this thing of the sustainability, is that the amount of foliage that is actually there is going to be regulated by how large the pocket is of soil here. So what you have basically is you have a container, you have nutrients that end up being on it that wash through it or collect, or basically sarissa. Nobody seems to understand bonsai sarissa. They say they die. They don't. You just don't fertilize them. If you fertilize them, they're dead. Very simple. Why? Because they actually take nutrients from the clay. So therefore, if it's already being fed that way, follow what the natural biome has, and you will actually begin to work with the plant rather than working against it. So naturalized. Methuselah tree, 4,700 and some years old and everything else like that. When it's very young, it's growing like this. Very large, very robust, very aggressive. And as the nutrients ran out and this pocket of soil was no longer there, it had less to go on. So it became smaller, 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 smaller. But that actually gives it a certain amount of sustainability, so it can actually stay in that particular biome longer. When I was in Tenruji, 2007, when I finally got out and sort of went, oh, okay, what's in my brain? This tree is 300 years old. 8 guys came in and pruned it in a matter of about 30 minutes, and I sort of went, gee, how'd you manage to do that? I said, well, we just follow the old cuts, which is a total other topic here of how do you follow other cuts that have been made by other people. And Al actually did the pine out front and sort of the first cut and following through and all the rest. I can follow what any other arborist has done. You can actually see where the pruning is. So this piece here will tell you where everything was pruned and you can go back to it. So if you want to do a really fast job, you can. That goes back to nature and what the shape is, so you're actually following the shape of nature that was before. The arborist previous is the shape of nature. You're just following what that nature was. So again, Shingo So, when it sort of fits in between. So things are getting smaller. The next thing that is actually a strength is that you have these twisted cylinders. Those actually take up space going up, and they actually create a very, very powerful and very strong cylinder as an engineering device. So your tree is not likely to fall over. This is like an extreme fail after a couple of 100 years. Your spruce trees, and this is actually pine. So this is actually the albicaulis, the white pine. And if you want to play with it and try it, just take a rope and twist it, and you all know basically that, if you wrap up paper in a cylinder, it's really hard to bend, and that's actually that tree. So you're actually building a type of bow-like effect so that the tighter that the rings become, the tighter your tree actually becomes, and the stronger it becomes, the more flexible it becomes. At the same time, that is more resistant to whatever catastrophes are, like snow load, wind load, catastrophe of any sort, so mechanical damages that you have. And here's actually where most of the cities go wrong, and I just can't seem to get the architects and landscape architects to actually agree on this because they just don't kind of get it. Japanese gardening does this. It basically says we have an X amount of soil container. Doesn't really matter what kind of soil it is, but we know that we can only grow this many leaves on it. So why does this have so many leaves up there? What you need to do is, as a pruner, you need to choose which leaders you're going to keep and which ones you're going to get rid of. Because the canopy, the amount of leaves, if it's only going to produce 1,000 leaves in this, you're still only going to have 1,000 leaves on this. It's just somebody's going to be less. So their failure is actually because they're not recognizing and choosing and making decisions, don't know how to prune to be able to get to saying, oh, these are the ones we want to keep. We don't want to keep the super strong ones. They're too vigorous, going to break anyway. The rings are too large. We want to keep the small ones that have had a tough time growing because they're going to be stronger. So that's actually where that is. Leaf size. Balance that whole system. So in this is a pot. It's going to tell you how many leaves there are. The tree is going to grow up to basically a majority of what the leaves are, and now you actually have to go back to it. What they don't see is they don't see the value of this whole thing. And in the very beginning, like 30 years ago, we didn't really have a replacement cost. We didn't have anything else that was going to say, gee, what's it going to actually cost to be able to produce that? And the amount of work that actually goes into a Japanese garden is phenomenally higher than what's actually done to a street tree, which is only pruned every 3 to 7 years. But it only has a lifespan of 7 to 17, so it's kind of a give and take in how much you want to put into it and how much you want to get out of it. But we still only value, if an arborist comes in, we value that Japanese garden tree the same as a street tree. And you go, it has probably about 900% more hours of pruning in it. And the sustainability is completely different from the street tree. So what are we going to do? So you look at this cost here and go, yeah, that's the way it's normally done. This is actually what you have now. They sort of build on that and have the nursery tree, 3 years of maintenance, and go, yeah, right, we've just barely begun. And this one here, where it goes 50-year cost-benefit analysis, now you actually have an inventory. That's actually a value. So you actually have a principal value, so a replacement value. So if you take out a tree and were to rebuild that garden, you can actually take it out, you can sell that tree for X number of dollars. So it actually has a value. Why? If you have the documentation of what you're doing, when you're doing, And you can sort of see where this is going now, is that I actually want you to make notes and do a little bit more work, which is really, really painful, especially for me. You sort of go, oh yeah, I did that. We all just sort of know when we're going to do something and so on and so forth. But if you actually keep notes on what this is and figuring out exactly the documentation, when to do what, and you're creating this sustainable, cost-effective work schedule. So keeping in mind that if you're pruning the trees winter, when everybody says go prune, that's almost the worst time to prune unless it's a young tree. You want to have mass on it, you want to grow lots, redirect all the energy. Your battery is 100%. It's going to grow into only what's left over. So it's going to shoot that all off into major directions. So you can actually get a lot of mass on there. Same as that Methuselah tree. It's got large tree rings, and then it actually gets smaller as you actually slow the growth. So now if you prune right in here, and closer to autumn and abscission, the more sugars you're stopping from going into the root system. And that actually is going to manage your tree so the next year it actually grows slower, tighter, less growth rings and everything else. So why again? Year after year tracking, you get a growth ratio. You can figure out how much that's going to be. So here you have 1 year, grows a lot. 10 years, you have this. You can do it a different way and still have sort of the same tree, what you get out of it. And here is what actually, once again, City of Calgary and everybody else is expecting, is that that tree is going to be that big. Well, it can be that size, but it's only going to have that much or that much foliage on it, on that mass. And that's what you're seeing out there for the color in the Nikka Yuko right now, is that they've managed actually where all of those leaves will go. And if they're slowing it down, oops, they only have this amount of growth, but they make it look like that. Now they've been successful. And out there, they've been really, really successful at it. And that changed a lot of things in my head for me. The next thing was actually got back to that physiology thing, and I sort of puzzled for a long, long time about exactly how do trees grow, why do they grow, digging into and drilling down into some of the research that's out there, looking at trees, cutting them in half, and finding out exactly what we've actually got. So when will it actually be mature? And I think it was one of the questions, actually, if you look at mountain maple, actually is about 28 years. And when the bark on the bottom comes up in the nubari and comes about 1/5 or 1/6 of the way up the bottom, so it turns from like green to that sort of a grayish, gnarly bark, that's when it actually starts throwing out and changing its physiology from upright growth to side growth. And it's about 25 to 35 years for a pine. So you're going to be fighting with pine for that long, unless you can change the number of years in one that it actually has. Next thing actually is keep your eyes on this thing right here. This is actually how you plant a tree. 0 is yes, X is no. Here's what you're actually doing. In doing this, you have, say, a 40-foot tree. Here, at 40 feet, it's already 30 feet high. So automatically you can begin to prune and maneuver and manage that particular tree. This one here, you're actually growing it up at 2 angles. And this is actually refurbishment actually of a tree in Japan, and actually how you would actually go about refurbishing a tree that's totally overgrown. So basically, when they change from horizontal growth, or they change to horizontal growth and it becomes sustainable, when they go from vertical growth, you cannot actually sustain them. So basically, your adventitious buds, your sucker shoots and everything else, though useful, as in everybody has always said, oh, cut them off. And you go, no. I actually use them. I actually produce them on purpose because people have a tendency to prune out everything right in here. And the sign of someone who doesn't really know how to prune is that they've pruned so that all of this is gone. It's going to happen anyway. But if you can't get the growth back here, this branch breaks off, or this branch breaks off, and you've got nothing to actually grow with. You're going to have to go up to the next one. And then that tree starts looking older and older and older until it needs replacing. So if you can keep the younger growth or growth recurring down in here, you will actually have an advantage over the trees that will not. So getting new growth back, if you cut this severely, you will get suckers all the way. Now, if you take those suckers and cut them within about 1 inch of their life and leave 1 inch for stubs, you grow out 2. And 3 years later after that, by keep on cutting them, you will actually bend that all the way around into a curve so it turns into a regular branch. So you can close or slow down the rest of this growth by pruning it regularly and allow one branch to grow. You can bring it all the way up to mass. So it's basically a bonsai technique applied to city trees or any other tree that you actually want. So it's a management system, once again, putting all of your systems together for pruning. Pruning is basically an event. And we sort of look at it as a sort of a maintenance necessity, but in its own way. If somebody comes along, like I took off a large branch. It did a number of things to that basic tree that caused reactions, and that reaction would causes something else so that you can actually do something with it. So once again, it's like the cutting back to the sucker roots. You're actually trying to create something that is very positive that can actually be used in a different way. Whatever a tree does is basically good because it's going to do it anyway. So if you have a moose that comes along and pulls your tree right in half, that's storm damage, mechanical damage, and everything else. What you're trying to do now is you're trying to get when an event happens so that you're actually trying to tell when a plant is actually going to do something and when it's not going to do something, and what is its pattern. So we do things, we drink coffee in the morning, we get up, we sleep, we eat, and in between we go to work and so on and so forth. So, calendar, what is it? And literally it shows the days, weeks, months, seasonal information, it's phenology, it's a cycle. It actually creates that thing that you need to know about. I thought I'd throw this in because we think in terms of when is July, when is June, when is spring in its particular months. And when I sort of went to Tucson and sort of went, okay, learning to prune here, yeah, spring in March was actually back in October. And you sort of went, yeah, back to the beginning. So can you actually read the trees and tell what's happening, and how do you actually figure out what is happening with all of them? So in Japan, getting into black pine, it's one of those things, pine is a favorite topic. Love those things. This is in Tokyo. This is what you're actually going to do for the entire season. You're sent out to work and you just do this. So when is spring? But if you look back 210 days from our basic monsoon cycle, which actually happens, actually about second week in August, this actually puts it into our spring is going to be January week 2. Problem. We don't really have spring January week 2. We actually have this in March. So what we need to do is we need to actually say that the calendar is a tool. We have key events. When something is happening with a tree, we know the actual growth. We know the action that we should take. We know the length of time the action took, as in how long did it take you to prune it this year? How long will it take next year? How long was it even the last year? And what kind of a history do you actually know on these things? So what is expected actually for next year's action so that you can actually predict how much it's going to be. Because really, as a contractor, you're going in and you're saying, hi, I'm going to prune your tree and it's going to be $100. And they go, okay, fine, that's really nice. And you go, I'm going to have to come back next year and I'm going to have to prune your tree as well. And they go, ooh, how much is that going to be now? And you go, well, it might be another $100. And you go, well, that's $200 in two years. So does this keep on building up every year, or what does it happen? Like, when do we actually begin to save a little bit of money? And you go, well, actually, when it stops being youthful and actually changes its growth, and if we can actually get it to change its growth faster, you'll start saving money sooner because we'll have the shape that we need and we can slow the growth down. That's when you don't need us anymore. We'll have a couple of years in between to breathe. So that's actually what you're trying to do here, is trying to figure out where you're actually going to get that break and when your client is actually asking for it. Otherwise, they just feel like they're a big money pit. And it's very true. It can be. You prune in the wintertime, you're making a money pit for them. They're not going to like you in the long run. They're going to find a different arborist. Why? Can't stress this enough, is that, is the winter the best? Spring seems to be a month instead of a season. Everything seems to be in human terms rather than actual plant terms. With the bonsai, you can actually change that season. So you can actually just simply say that if you dry it out a little bit, you will end up having senescence or quiescence, and that will actually cause dormancy. So now we have the requisite pine, and every garden, couldn't help but put that in there. That was 2003? Is that actually when we came through? 2003, 2004, I think. This is actually red pine in Kanazawa. I love that, actually. I think that actually Jake put that into his book for Niwaki, actually. That's a technique. That's not a style. That's got very little to do with style. It literally is, how do you use up 200 feet of tree growing straight up and make it only 40 feet or 45 feet? And so what he's doing is he's kind of curlicuing this thing for like a lot of years and just sort of making it around and around and around, and he uses up all of that space. So technically his style has evolved because of a management technique. So he needed to manage 200 feet of tree, and this is how he chose to do it. He decided to be a little bit ornamental. That's fair enough. Black pine. We'll talk about momiyage. Basically, black pine, and of course, this is actually the old form of black pine on the seashore, and this is actually why they're melancholy. They actually push into the wind. And they have these multi-trunked instead of single-trunked aspects that are very, very strong and very vigorous, because whenever it goes into the wind, the cell structure is dried out by the wind, so therefore it actually contracts, constricts, shrinks, and the tree actually bends downwards, because the opposite side of this is filled with moisture. For the wind that comes in, the moisture collects right here and it's stripped off here. So that will actually overgrow itself, and so you actually get this whole curve that goes out onto the beach. And that's part of how it's shaped. So when you get people with windswept trees and the bonsai and everything else, they're actually leaning backwards in the wind, you kind of go, I wonder what beach they were on. Yeah, it doesn't really work. It kind of works like that. But so in between, all of this is basically typhoons strip off the needles. And basically the follicles are loosened up. And it's the only pine that you can actually do that with. You can't do that with the other pines. So if you go into like a red pine and everything else, you technically have to cut them. Otherwise the follicles are actually cut, or actually damaged, and you're not going to have rebudding on it. It's only the black pine that actually does that. That's Teuberiana. So nevertheless, Midoritsuki, and this of course thanks to Jake, basically, what you're doing here, this actually creates more solar collectors. So you're creating more candles. Every time that you actually create another candle, you have one more tree. So you have to think about it, that over and above how many candles you're creating in the tree, that's how strong you're actually making it. And to come up with actually where the nutrients sit in a pine tree later on, and it may start to make a little bit more sense on it. So this actually ends up being, there we go, a very, very strong tree. And how are you actually going to manage it? The tree breaks itself actually into compartments, which is another fascinating thing on it. So this is momiage. It replaces or replicates a natural leaf stripping, and you get smaller needles and everything else. Why? Because you've actually taken the nutrients out of the tree. So technically, rather than actually creating more buds, it does do more buds, but it actually takes nutrients out so that you actually weaken the tree. You're actually making it grow a little bit less and growing it to manipulate it to where you want it to be. Because again, as I say, or have heard, it is a weed tree. So you're opening up, but it's actually the strigolactone engages the mycorrhizae and actually calls for it. Let me just go back to cycles here for a second. So I just want to just bring this home, because when you take out a nutrient from a pine tree, it actually starts the entire strigolactone mycorrhizae interaction. Okay. So roughly, this is what happens. I sort of know, and I walk outside and I go, August 1st, yep, bang. If it's July 31st, then it's just a little bit early, and I go, what's wrong with the squirrels? Okay, so when is winter hitting, right? But I look at what's naturally happening out there, and I go, August week 2 is my human calendar. Everything else is just beginning to dry out. My pine needles are browning off. The candle buds are setting. They're starting to get sugar on it. The mycorrhizae, all of a sudden, when I start pulling things out of pots, and I start looking at the roots, and I go, gee, mycorrhizae is almost there. Cedars are a little bit behind. Junipers aren't quite there yet. So the pines are the first ones to actually respond to all this. Maybe they're more sensitive than all the rest. And I go, all right, that tells me what? And you start building this whole calendar for yourself so you can actually work with it. So right in here, you end up being frozen. Your basic contortas will change color, and that tells you something else. And that basically everything is frozen, nothing is moving anymore. It turns green, the nutrients are moving again. It turns green again. But in actual fact, dormancy is actually the water, which is actually the cell structure, moves between the cell structure. So it's not in the tree anymore, it's in the cell structure. And then it comes back into the cells and turns the tree green. And then basically when it freezes again, it goes out of the tissues again, in between the tissues, and makes it yellow. So it actually changes color that way. So you can actually tell what's happening. All the other ones basically will turn a little bit darker green, darker black. Something else will happen to them. But if you notice the shades and the variations on it, and just the color differences, you'll notice a difference. That's basically what happens to the roots. And again, I engaged Dr. Funk and said, gee, so here's what I'm seeing. Am I crazy? And basically, you end up having this growth. The cambium still grows. The leader does this. And where we are, we actually have a second leader growth right in there. So find the identifiable key. I use this. That's a pine flower. I don't know if you see many of those. Seen any of those? Anybody seen those? No? Yes? 1, 2? Yeah. That basically turns into your cone, strobeli. So the female, the male. And this is actually one of the other signifiers. It's really fast. I can actually walk by on a tree and I can just kind of go, okay, when that little nodule, we get the first one, Then you get the second one comes out, or actually that's the first, that's the second, you get a third, and basically sugar comes out, all of a sudden the wasp starts gathering and everything else, right? Everything sort of happens in this whole cycle, which is this natural cycle. And you go, it doesn't really matter to me when that happens, because you can induce it, and you can do this in June. And so if you were to suddenly have all of the right things happening with nature, it's going to be June, it's not going to be August. You know, it could happen in November just as easily. So it's based on the plant, it's not based on what I have on my calendar there, and I'm pruning based on the client. And I do have actually a little thing that sort of says to the client, I reserve the right to prune at the right season for the right effect. You tell me what you want, but I will go in and tell you when that actually has to be. And I will stick with that, because you can't tell me to go in and prune. It has its negative consequences, though, as well. So identify the conditions. It's going to be frozen. Is this going to be torrential? Is it going to be absolute drought? What's going to actually happen with that? And this is actually the why. So as these sugars get right about there, these roots look like this. And this is actually the mycorrhizae, that little point right there. This is actually the impregnation that actually is caused by that. But that's actually the mycorrhizae growth. If you transplant at this time of year, you'll have success. If you transplant when you do not have that, and that goes with almost all conifers, and most trees have mycorrhizae, but basically you can see it actually, and it's available to be seen on coniferous trees. Those two simultaneously, you look at that in the nursery and you go, yep, time to transplant. I see one or two coming up. I better prepare to basically book off time to be able to do that. And that's how you actually manage to get it. This is actually what it looks like. That is the mycorrhizae. This is where the strigolactone is actually interacting with it. And that's actually the meristem and actually where this entire thing is. And the colors are not that color. They've actually dyed it so that you can actually see it. So in that cross section there. But that is the point of where the filaments of the mycelium actually interact. And this on the inside is actually where the tree actually creates it. So as it matures past year 3 or so in the plug form or growth form, seedling form, this mycorrhizae actually comes out, interacts with the mycelium, and creates its own unique type of mycelium. And that actually is based on because of this. This is the fun part. When you prune a pine, and to be able to stimulate the strigolactone, if you say, gee, I want to have fertilizer in there. So if you pour fertilizer on this thing, it's not going to matter. You can just keep on fertilizing until you're blue in the face. Nothing's going to happen. The moment that you actually cause a reaction, an event that actually is pruning or cutting off or mechanically altering something, you've removed those needles, typhoon comes along, strips all the needles off, that's an event in a pine. And you're looking for these events in all other trees and what will happen with it. Because that immediately says, oh, I need some nutrients, I need to replace what I just lost, otherwise I'm going to have to die, I'm going to have to compartmentalize, I'm going to have to kill something else off. So you take it away. So basically, the pine doesn't take anything from the roots. This is actually where it puts it, and puts it into the lower third, into this battery, and it actually recycles all of the nutrients in the tree. So the root has no value. It's only that mechanism to be able to take that information and to be able to put it all the way into the tree as nutrients and sugars and everything else. So in this case, the starches and sugars don't go back down into the root system as they do in the deciduous trees, but they stay in the needles, the bark, and so on. And that's actually why we end up having momiagi, Midoritsuki, and actually removing the needles and what you do with it. So in having that pruning event, you're actually stimulated fertilizer. You can do that almost any time of year. Animals do it any time of year. But you're going to have to look at the consequences of what you do if you have growing too late in the season. And if you have enough time for those needles to mature and to be able to create the sugars. Because if you do it too late in the season, you won't have that. You will end up having the tree brown off extra much because there's too much water and so on in the system, and it can't go in between it. That's the lesson that we get from here. So, deciduous. We have the winter leafless pruning, causes growing. Leaf color change, when you do it at a position. Like right now, I have my entire clients that I just simply go through to be able to reduce and keep things in the right size. Evergreens, generates more energy. Stripping reduces the energy. Mycorrhizae is activated by the signals. And you can decide that. Meanwhile, back in Alabama, we end up having cycles. So you go into Texas, for example, and you can have 9 to 13 different years in 1 year. And a lot of people will mechanically induce that, and they don't even realize that they're actually doing it. They just kind of go, okay, we're going to go out and prune. You go, okay, fine, gee, you just had a season change. oh gee, we're just 1 year closer to maturity, or one cycle closer to maturity, when you're actually going to get that side growth rather than the upper vertical growth. And this actually is the dormancy period of what happens in Alabama. 75% of your pine are actually tropicals. They are not actually cold weather plants. So in tropicals, they are going to have, we have Alberta, we have 2 bud seasons. In Alabama, we have 7. And it goes on from there. So it breaks itself apart. So keeping in mind then, pine, coniferous, the storage battery is not the roots. Deciduous, it's the roots. This is actually for directing growth, reducing growth. Too many times I've come into a client's place and the client has said, gee, our trees are growing so slowly, we called an arborist in to see if we can actually prune them and get them to grow. And you go, gee, you just wasted 8 years of work to try to slow them down so they're just not costing you as much. Guess what? Your next pruning bill, call this arborist back, it's going to be about $800 next year, so good luck with that. So this is quiescence, inducing dormancy. You can actually take your calendar and you can actually artificially induce it. So you're actually applying a bonsai technique. So let's reduce the water on it. It's going to end up saying that, gee, this is August. You cut the irrigation off, put the irrigation on, which is going to be spring, and then turn the irrigation off. You basically induce the same spring cycle and the fall cycle. So you can actually use all the different mechanisms that there are that are offered by nature to be able to do that. So again, you can actually do maple leaf stripping as well. It's a forced cycle, but you will end up having smaller leaves because it can't produce as much, doesn't have as much sugars, and you're actually running a bit of a risk, but you know that you will be reducing the tree by about 30 to 50%. So it's a question of how much you want to do when. So in speeding up the growth, you can actually go back, prune in the wintertime. You can actually leave it to grow an extra year or 2 without any pruning in between, prune it in year 3, and that actual result, that event, will actually cause the tree to have reaction of wood, and that will cause it to grow faster and faster all the time. Somewhere in there, you're going to have to end up figuring out how much you've actually spent on that tree, and where is that predictive cost for where you're going to get back to slowing it down so that you can actually keep everything in cost. So what it does for the major public garden is it says, our entire pruning calendar is now predictable. We can actually say, this is going to cost us X amount. We'll go back to the slide that's about 15 back now, and it goes, we've reduced this by 30%, and then we will actually have 15% more growth, but it's less by 15%, and we built it slower and slower and slower. So in about 5 to 6 to 7 years, you can actually only get, say, 2 or 3 inches of growth on an apple tree that normally grows 12 inches. Then you have nothing to prune. You go in once every 2 or 3 years. As long as no one alters that by actually creating an event and turning the sprinkler system on, you're fine. But if somebody does something like that, you're going to shoot it all off again. Smaller case study. This is Kuno Garden, this is Vancouver. One of the things that was leading to all of this is that they insist on pruning this only in mid to late August. And I sort of went, okay. At that time going, why would you do that? So they completely missed the spring season. I sort of said, gee, that's really a mess. I don't think I can do that. I don't think I can really do that. That, I'd be told that I did a really lousy job. But on the other hand, they said, well, let's just sort of take the payoff on the other side. We only have to go in once a year. We're volunteers. We don't get paid for this. At the same time, we actually end up getting all of this growth back here, but where we're losing it is we don't have any back-budding growth. We've actually lost all of this. So I said, gee, can you just kind of change that growth just a little bit and see exactly what you get? So 3 years later, you end up with this kind of growth growing back in, and that's black pine. So you can actually change that and actually revert it. So for about 3 years after it's bare, you can actually get some back budding on black pine. Black pine as well, if you happen to leave the stubs on it, or any pine for that matter. If you prune in the spring, don't have this slide, no I don't. If you're basically doing this and you candle actually earlier in the year, it will actually cause budding or back budding. So if you forget about your candling that you're going to do in our May and June, and actually want back budding. So if you go in March and take off all of the lead candles, you actually will cause back budding that will be about 1/3 back on the branch. If you go in then in April and May and cut off those next ones that are live but have live buds in the back, you can actually push that back so you get 4 years in one. It's kind of a neat thing. It's so the experiments in between, this was actually Untitled and the Mugos in between. That's the literature that sort of went into this. it's fine print, so you don't really have to check it, but nevertheless, if you sort of get your hands on this one at some point in time, you can check it out. It'll be fine. Thanks for listening. Questions? Any questions that I can answer? Enough? Enough? That's it? Lunchtime?
Yes.
Yes.
When you are showing a slide from your magazine and try to explain about the intention of the design,
Yes.
and all those pictures is very young.
True.
So that you emphasize some of the important plant material, how long you can keep it. Those stems are getting fatter and fatter and fatter. And especially Zoki grouping plantation, that many stem from the ground. The time that was planted, just right amount of the stem. But those stems getting fatter, probably within 7 years, 3 times as fatter, as the picture indicates what we see. So how you deal with that number of the stem for the space? So my practice in pruning those design concepts, that I have to reduce the number of the stem to keep the space between the stem close to the original stages. So that means if you have 12 stems, 7 years you waited, probably you have to reduce 5 of the stem out of 12. Then another 5 years, another 3 to 5 stems to reduce in order to have the space between the stem. So 20 years, how many stems is going to leave?
Thank you. I've had actually the same question comes to when, okay, what you're proposing is not really possible. So number one, if you do actually weaken all of this foliage because of how much is actually taking off, so it's almost like daisugi, and you're taking off the tops, and you're actually reducing it, but you do reducing it on deciduous tree. So therefore, the growth rings will be smaller. That is the number one way. Number two way, and they sort of said, oh, gee, do you really want the answer to that? And I kind of went, yeah, I do. I said, well, root prune. So we actually slow the growth that way. And going around and say, divide into 6 and do 3, and then do 3, and then do 3, and then do 3. And I said, gee, that's a lot of work. Isn't there some other way that you can actually do it? Because there is another way, but you really have to look at the balance, and that's exactly what you're saying, what you're drawing to, is that if you're doing a good job, and if you're following where all the balance is, there's a hole right there. And so basically you're regrowing one young one, but this is actually an X on purpose, so you really need to leave that one to actually stop you in creating a stop point there in the design. But this one here, that one right in between the two, and that one right there can end up coming out, and you will grow 2 on the other side. So you actually are just simply rotating it around and around and around, and growing up a new stem all the time. So there's always a new one. It's not an ideal solution, but it is one of these solutions that sort of says, yes, we can actually do that, and we can get around it, and will people actually notice that difference? Only if you have a really, really good eye, and you actually can go in and go, no, Masa would definitely notice it, like just glaring.
That Zoki is undergrowth tree in the nature land. That's where the landscaper discovered the beauty, fell in love, tried to import into the urban environment, and the nurture and fertilizer and proper pruning that forced them to grow twice as much as natural environment. That's the gene of the plant. So if you drastically change the environment, that plants react totally different than what you expect to see happen. So that's my I haven't seen the mature Zoki residential garden. If you have some good photograph, well maintained, lasting long time, please show to me.
Exactly, yes.
Until then, I just deny that that is a short trend person discovered. But
Let me see if I can get back to the end of this.
sustain long time.
In
Which
Calgary?
rather means long time means 50 years. You have to exist with moderate maintenance. Okay, not just leaf stripping off, like he said. After, regular pruning, and then you have to strip the number of the leaves to deny their full growth capacity. Okay. Is that what the human wants? To maintain the design integrity. Is that what you're really comfortable doing there? That's always come to me that. And then it's always designers, they have to visit to instruct. But you are teaching that we have to read designers' mind to apply your pruning tools. That's impossible. That's impossible.
I try to think that nothing is impossible, and I think some of the challenges you've given me that I thought were really impossible have actually succeed.
To me, that's human beings. I just cannot do it.
No. What I like in Calgary in some respects is that the average landscape lasts about 7 years in Calgary. I don't have to worry about it. They will actually change it. It's very rare that you can actually get a landscape that actually lasts a long time, which for me is disappointing. I have one or two that are 35 and getting 38 years old. So there's only a couple of them that are around. But in between, other people have maintained and managed them in between and cut very harshly or cut differently. So the landscape is totally different from what I would have envisioned in the first place. So it's not as easily sustainable. And to go back in and do it again, and you sort of look at it and go, gee, you can't. The trees are already overgrown. You can't really back that up. You may as well just simply take it out as you're doing, as you propose. The next thing is that it actually only works in the older neighborhoods that we actually have. So if we have a lot of poplars that actually suck a lot of nutrients out of the ground, then we can actually keep it in competition a lot longer, as well as the alleliopathy that is provided by these poplars, that they just try to kill everything else off. So you're really trying to make that undergrowth tree as strong as you possibly can, rather than actually weakening it in between. You're actually watering it extra so the poplar doesn't kill it. So in this area, we basically adjusted a little bit differently. This is actually one that was started building in 2009, and it was actually just an exercise for myself, well, actually on Kisei. So it's not really as far as a really good garden design, but I wanted to see where lines of force would actually go and work with it. But sort of immaterial is the reason why, but you'll see, like Mas will immediately see some of the areas where stonework could be better, or tree work could be better, and those other little things, and that's what I'm answering there. In here, this piece down here, the owner, this is actually a third garden for him that I've actually built. And he doesn't like to water anything at all. And he just sort of said, Ed, can you come back? Can you build this for me? And going, yep, sure, that'll be fine. And this was the existing mountain ash, and it has roots that go all the way over here. It's not a very aggressive tree, but it actually takes up enough nutrients that it challenges everything else on that line. These Genalia and Tartaricum in between, this is actually the Ohio buckeye that is right in there. This whole area inside there is actually a large water reservoir, and it holds actually about 2,200 gallons of water in it, and that is actually filled in then with porous material and paving material and everything else so that I don't have to water. All the eaves basically run all the way down into this and run through a stream bed that actually runs and irrigates all of this. It sort of ends up pushing through all of these stones so that it will weep out, and you have the small masses that actually come into it. This is a very large ash tree, and you can see actually from just simply the coloration that this is already weakened just simply by being in here. This is year, is it 09? So this would be actually be 12. So basically 3 to 4 years later, this one here is already showing signs of being weakened. So I can actually keep this very easily, and I think that we actually pruned about 3 branches on it, and that was it, nothing. There's nothing to do on it because it will eventually starve and die off. There was an event here that took out 60% of that ash tree, so it's now getting sunlight. But originally, this was completely in the shade, except for the early morning sun, so it actually got the heat. It's technically a zone 5, which for us is good because we're a zone 3. But
What is the location here?
this is Calgary.
Excuse me?
Calgary, and this is actually an east face. Behind is actually west, where the fir trees are. Behind us there is actually west. So in that sense, it's a study actually in how many heat units will these stones actually put into this garden so that I can actually grow the azaleas, growing the rock spray cotoneaster and the zone 5 and zone 6 trees, and how close can I get. I have a wisteria growing in the back here, actually, so, and one of them has died, replaced it with another one. We'll see how actually that one does at this point in time. But this here is actually overgrowing still, so I'm still going to have to do something about it because this reservoir is now too much. So there's a spruce right in here to actually absorb an awful lot. When this Norway spruce starts growing into its tree form and takes over this entire bit and we prune it, this root system will actually cover right into there and it will significantly weaken that. I'm sort of worried on a design sense on whether or not it will weaken it too much or hold it back too much in competition. But that is the way that I'm trying to get around it because again, the challenge is given. I don't know if I can succeed or not, but if I never try it, then I'll never know. And that's actually the big part about it is, and this gentleman actually lets me do that. He's a doctor over at the Rocky View, and it just sort of says, you know, it's management, and it's all about management and how you manage it. So, you know, give it a whirl. We love the look anyway. This stuff here, this one here actually gets the water from the eaves right here, so you can tell the color is totally different. And it's the same tree as this one here, and the same actually cultivar cross that it is. So, yes. There are problems, but in turn, I don't think that the problems are actually something that Calgary has to worry about because of the cold. We have so little growth. What grows, even in Lethbridge, that would grow in 2 years will take us 4 to 5 years to grow in Calgary. What grows in 2 years in Portland and Seattle and everything else will take us 10 to 12 years to grow. So our scale of how everything is slowed down makes Zokidoniwa a little bit easier to work with. That's sort of a native weed tree. And as long as you stay native rather than going ornamental, where the aggression is there to actually overgrow itself, then you might have some problems. But we're trying to stay as closely to the biome as we possibly can. So that's what we're trying there. But I really do appreciate that. And listening even in yesterday's conversation, going, I'll have to maybe rethink this, and I wonder how I will rethink this and what I will do to actually affect it a little bit differently. Because yeah, this one here is now right up to here. It has no competition outside of grass. And it has all of the heat units that's actually in this driveway as well, and it hasn't even gotten down into this area yet. It's only right about just sort of touching the edge of it, but you can sort of see where these branches are getting massively strong because of the heat, and these are actually slowing down for the challenge of the hedge in the back of that. So I'm going to have to end up pruning this 3 times compared to the 1 time in the back there and trying to balance out the two. So yes, you're right, I'm having the same problems, and it is a question of, can I actually overcome them? Maybe not. If I don't try, I'll never know. But thanks. Anything else? Any other thoughts on that, Masa? What would you recommend?
Yeah, can you go back to the very beginning of the slide where that Nikka, Nikka Museum, that the pine versus maple.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Is that
I'm
your
curious.
Ferrari?
Yeah, exactly. I would.
Yeah, this is the picture. That.
What
So
would
the
you- what
pine
would you
tree
do?
was planted after. Okay. And how close they are?
8 feet, 8.5 feet.
8.5. Maple versus pine.
Yeah, and I'm being generous right now. It's on a small hill. They were good enough to put it on a little hill. But outside of that, it has no reservoir or root system that it can actually go to. So that is
who maintain and what is the pruning schedule and what kind of vision they have to keep two in the perfect balance?
I asked and I didn't get an answer. It was VJJ. Tsuyoshi-san was going in actually, and he was called in to take another look at it. So I think that it will change. It was Okusa-san that actually, in our conversation, sort of we got there in the morning, and he sort of went, "Gee, you know," and he sort of go, "Okay, future test coming up." Question comes out. I go 3 times. He goes twice in pruning, and going, "Okay, when?" And once again, he's sort of saying, "Well, I'd go late summer or late spring, human terms." After everything is hardened off in tree terms, and then just before color change, but actually he would go 2 weeks earlier than color change. And sort of, you know, raising the eyebrow, and he sort of adds to that and sort of going, I think that actually the sugars are in a maple, they actually go down earlier and it's building over the summer rather than waiting for as late as you do in your climate. So I would actually do this earlier and, you know, balance it accordingly.
Yeah, this picture shows the density of the maple. That
Yes.
is really bothering me. My
It's-
eye.
It's the mountain maple.
Because of the volume, that's what disrupting the balance between the maple and the pine.
This is that, and as you say, and as you put the two
So
together, this is
if the
problem.
owner decided we have to keep both, what kind of pruning treatment we have to do it?
That is my question. And that is actually the question that I actually put to the director.
Right. And in Japan, that I often hear that when the dormancy season, that foliage drop off, to reduce the large stem, to reduce significant size, but yet they can retain the natural form. That's what the general practice among Japanese gardeners in Japan.
Are we thinking Tokyo or are we thinking Kyoto? Or
Both.
both?
You would prune it in dormancy?
In dormancy, that the large stem, wherever that the longest shoots, that searching the origin of the growth, we just remove. So the far left, see that far left excess? Where that branch is coming from, searching to the origin of the growth.
In studying the tree, actually, it is pretty much lined out. It was pruned at one time, as you can see there, and grouping here, grouping here. In Vancouver, and
So, yeah, require a high skill to determine that which rim to remove
yep.
to obtain the form.
One problem, though, that I have with that is that, and this is going back to Kyoto, you cut anything larger than my wrist, and here in Vancouver, it splits automatically, and within about 2 years, 3 years, the pathogen has already gotten past the compartmentalization and gone into the mainstream, so it's killing the tree. So then it severely dies back. I do know that the pine will be of greater value than the maple, and I know that we can replace the maple easier, but that's not really the answer. The answer is still, how would you actually prune it? And it's reached the point, in my opinion, that you're going to have to do something drastic to it and eventually end up replacing it. It's the same problem as with the pine behind the bell tower, is that you're right in between of what are you going to really do with it. At this point in time, I would still probably, and sort of being the optimist as I always am, and sort of going, ooh, how can we save that? Or, what's the win-win-win situation that we can find in it? And I would be hoping that a lot of this can be stripped out and the ends cut back to new leaders that is only just a little bit larger than my thumb. But that's might be wishful thinking because it's grown so fast that this growth from here up is 1 year right now. That was from when I was there in March, and this is again in August, and Sumi Awards, so mid-August. And in those months, that grew, and I just kind of went, wow. And you guys haven't pruned it yet? Really? Seriously? So yeah, if this is Zoki no Niwa, and if this is the tree that is normally there, and in that example there, this is the kind of maple that there is there, yes, we have a definite problem with those particular trees in that design. Would I use, and do we have maples that grow that strong or that can be used for Zoki no Niwa? No, we don't really have anything in Alberta that actually grows that strong. We'd have to use Saskatoon. If we get them over 9 feet, we're really lucky. Cotonia aster growing it into the small tree, it's not going to do too much. So if we choose the right species, we have a better chance on it. But yeah, good point. So when would you actually prune this? That would be my question. So what would you do? Would it be once, twice, 3 times? Large limbs, small limbs? I don't care. What would you do to prune it? How would you bring it back? Because it's Seattle, it's that high pathogen area.
I've been practicing through the Nike campus, 3 locations that we have maintaining Japanese maple upright. That one section is end of July. The next section is first week in August. And then the 3rd location we've been doing end of October. So just,
This is Portland?
yeah, my study, when is the best time? Does not matter. Does not matter.
Oh, they react the same,
React the same.
all the schedules?
Yeah, does not matter. But however, that when the foliage is opened up, we end up a little bit, winter scene is not desirable because of that we're snipping a lot of the terminal cuts.
Yeah.
So the end is more like this.
Right.
So that every several years I have to ask to go with winter pruning to reduce these
Yeah. Small.
knuckle.
Yeah.
Knuckle.
And take it back so that you're back to it.
So
What about bleeding?
the breeding is the same, that regardless of dormancy, they breed.
Yeah. I mean, you know,
Because-
maple sugar, maple syrup,
and
right?
it's
What else is
sugar.
it gonna do?
And then I was one occasion in Seattle Japanese Garden in December that we knew the cold spell come from Alaska. And so I cut big green and breeding heavily. The next morning we show up, it ice cold. I was concerned that, oh gosh, might severe causing the heating damage. No.
It's interesting. I have kind of done the same thing. What I noticed actually in going back the next day to finish the job was that when that melted, it had actually stopped. And it was almost the same as a plug that was like, a spruce. And basically it'll bleed out and then all of a sudden it stops. And so I was kind of going, okay, there's another phenomenon actually that's sort of happening, and not having a chance to actually do it again. And of course the fear that I sort of going, gee, am I really doing something terribly the wrong way? I don't really want to experiment on these particular trees, but it's very interesting that yours was
Yeah,
stopped.
because of my pruning practice, I can't select the time.
Yeah.
But all studies written, what's the best time, and you can't do that. Whenever available, that's the best time for me. So I take a chance and improving something. Oh yeah, no problem. That's how I learn.
I'm still at the stage where
But more study that I will have to be very cautious about. Not science.
no, I'm trying to run my
That
experiments
really
at the same
restrict
time.
my timing, that can I have to compress hours to take care of those? I can't do that.
Yeah.
So, but Lethbridge is a different story because the climate.
It changes again, yes, and that's actually where it changes from area growth zone or biome to biome to biome.
Different.
What I will mention that's actually very, or I find actually very interesting, in my world basically, and sort of building what is for agriculture and from the, basically the fertilizer and seed supply all the way up to the table and all the people, the chain of everything that is actually brought there. In Canada's medical world right now, we actually recognize that if 2 practitioners from 2 separate villages actually come up with the same solution for something, then it becomes a truth. So therefore, as in medically acceptable, so that something is a truth. So technically what we've just done is we've actually identified a phenomena, and it then merits study to see if that can actually be recreated, that if it bleeds out, freezes, that the sugars actually stop and actually cauterize and the compartmentalization does not go any further and cracking does not go any further. Is that, and can that actually become a technique then? And that mistake actually creates that whole technique. So that's the important part there, because again, for NAJGA, we were trying to actually get sort of the white papers are trying to figure out what we can have as a main pruning technique, or what do you do at what point in time, and when do you actually diverge from one area to the other to say, oh, right now it's 3 weeks past this way, it's better off to actually do that, and then after a while the person and the practitioner will learn that they can actually take those ideas and actually develop their own regimens to be able to have them work and to do the things that they need to with that tree for that particular location.
I think we were talking climate specific, obviously, like Marcel was saying, we prune roughly 2,000 pine trees in a winter.
Yeah.
You know, we start now and we finish hopefully by March, April.
Exactly.
And the early result is different, but the end result by midsummer is the same. Okay, you can't notice that one was pruned in let's say now in October, and one was pruned in April. You don't see that difference later.
Do me a favor. Take a photograph of all the way along the trees in the nursery and see if you can get the atmospheric conditions, as in find one atmospheric condition that is normal, as in just sort of a, oh, it's a regular day here. And take a look at the greens after and sort of see where the greens after pruning are in that beginning to that end. And then actually do it, say, 6 months later in the autumn and see where it is in, say, that spring Midori-tsuki period to the Momiagi period, if we use that as a general terminology then, and see if there's actually a change now in the difference in color to see where...
Just color.
Yeah, you're looking for color, and actually what I'm looking for is that the pine tree divides itself into thirds, so it actually takes up nutrients into the bottom third first, and that's where you actually keep that large branch. So in cutting off the large branches in here, I cut off a certain amount of that reservoir because that's that first year where it's gone in. So in year 3, this nutrient would actually be cycled to the top of the tree, and there's nothing for the top of the tree, and that's why every 3 to 4 years you have this entire nutrient cycle where the needles fall off and actually need to renew themselves. But there's that saying that you come up, and again, years I've always followed the old gardener's tales ever since being that high, to say what happens or what happened 3 years ago is what's going to show up in that 4th year. So basically the pine that you buy, you don't know what happened 3 years ago, and if it suddenly dies, you sort of have to look at it, cut it in half forensically, go this, and they did this and this and this with pruning, cutting, fertilizer, no fertilizer, what do the rings tell you, and so on, so that you're actually seeing where the nutrients came in, 2nd year, 3rd year, 4th year cycles all the way, and this keeps on going around and around and around. So I think what you'll find is that the growth in the top of the tree is going to be more vigorous at one point in a certain place in that row, and in the middle green will be a little bit different, and that lower green will be a little bit different.
Be pruned earlier in the season,
yeah.
And we're going to stimulate that upward.
Well, it actually brings the nutrients in a different amount of what the availability is, because you're dealing with pH.
Possibly. But also in our climate, we don't go, the conifers really don't go north.
I know.
Yeah,
I know. Yeah.
So it kind of changes that cycle.
Yes, mycorrhiza though is affected by how much moisture there is, and during that period that you're pruning, your moisture is pretty much high, so your mycorrhiza is very active. So it gives you continuity all the way through. But if there is any drying or any freezing that is actually in the ground, then that will actually show up in how much cycled nutrients you actually have in that tree. So I'm curious. I have seen in photographs and going to Seattle and everything else, in that period of time in the nurseries and going, oh, look, there's a color difference. Go back in and look at, my little camera and kind of go the Pentax and go play with color and going, no, it actually accentuates when I actually do this, and going, there is more green or there is less green, and then going back to our contortas and going, they're yellow in the winter, of course, compared to green, and when did they actually slow down in stasies, and when did they change the nutrients to where? So just another one of those little anomalies. There's so much to know about pines that...
We remove so many needles off of these trees that that color change might not even be noted. Definitely not be a photograph.
So what do you do with the needles?
They're thrown to the ground, raked up, and burned.
Okay, do you realize there's $750 a bale?
I didn't know that.
all right. I just thought I'd give you a side product there because basically if you want that for fertilizer and actually going through into that period of actually using it in the wintertime over the moss, so the moss is protected, that you actually go out and you buy your needles in a bale and you actually spread it around, then you collect it back up again from the client. So
Which,
There are disease issues.
there's a certain amount of fungal disease
Yeah.
that we have to,
Yeah.
it's
just saying, just saying.
a different climate.
I'll ship them to
Plus,
the price.
Sounds really
there's
good.
so much cheap mulch available there that, you know.
Oh, you need to get into the Japanese garden a little bit more, and you go. There's mulch, and then there's pine needle mulch. It's a
Yeah.
whole different world that you have.
In the desert, it's gorgeous.
Try it. Anything else? Are we time for lunch, or?
Yeah, time for lunch.
I have no idea. Okay, it is 12 noon. But any other question?
Yeah,
Thank you. Appreciate that.